We were camping at Lost Creek Campgrounds, west of Atlantic, Mississippi. We had been there for 2 days, and my girlfriend and I decided to go on a little adventure, since we didn't know the area all that well. It was about midday when we first came upon it. About 100 yards ahead of us, to our right, on the side of the track, was what we first thought was a regular dog. Most of it was just covered by trees, and it seemed to be lying down. We could clearly see a canine head and the start of its body. We both just stopped and stared over at it, not saying a word. You see, although my mind was desperately trying to convince me it was a regular dog, something looked very wrong with the whole picture. The thing is, you don't immediately think that you're going to see something that shouldn't exist, like some sort of monster, unless you don't believe in those things. We were both very practical people, and never really cared for urban legends or even things like scary stories. After all, that's just child's play, right? Well, if I'd ever heard the long-term Dogman before, maybe I would have thought differently. I would have never ever for one moment considered that they could possibly exist. I turned to my girlfriend and I said, "Do you see that dog?" And she looked at me, this look of utter terror that I had never seen before on her face, and just said, "That isn't a dog." And sure enough, as we were still, just standing there, as if we had been rooted to the ground, this dog stood up. It's hard to explain what exactly was going through my mind when we saw it stand, not on 4 legs, but 2, like a human. There was no way this large, actual dog had somehow perfected standing on its hind legs. The entire body and even its limbs were like that of a man. Again, if this human body had been naked and maybe hairless, then I would have covered my girlfriend's eyes. I thought there was some kinky stuff going on out there, but despite having the shape of a man's body, it was indeed covered in fur, just like an animal. It looked super lean and muscly. It couldn't have been a costume, not a furry like I thought it was at first. Even though we weren't super close, we could instead see regular hands and feet at the end of human-looking limbs. But I looked closer. They were actually human-like paws. I say human because they were somewhere between a hand and a paw. Think like a raccoon's hands. It walked slowly up from the trees on the side of the track and stood there, facing us in the middle of the dirt road. It didn't make a sound, it didn't move towards us. It just stared. And then I heard this terrible low rumbling, and realized to my terror, this was growling, and it was slowly retracting its lips, exposing its jagged, disgusting bare teeth. Having grown up with actual dogs, I knew this to be a warning sign. One that I knew meant run, which we did all the way back to camp, where we packed up our stuff and left, and not a second sooner. I've been around dogs all my life, and I have no idea what it was we saw that night. But I do know that I never want to see it again. This is a true story of my experience with an unknown canid creature in the woods of Northern California. My first encounter ever happened late one evening when I was out camping at Lake Davis, just north of Sacramento in the Deptford area. I'd wanted to spend some time on my own after going through a particularly bad breakup. Although I was okay, my friends and family had been bombarding me with messages. I was just feeling overwhelmed and needed to be off the grid for a few days at a time. I'd loved camping and nature as a kid. It seemed that was the perfect mini getaway. No electronics, just me, nature, and a good paperback. Although I'd made a snap decision to head out, I had done some research and asked about when buying the tent and equipment to make sure I was not heading into bear or cougar country. This is how I was pretty certain that the scratching and snuffling I could hear wasn't one of those, at least. Of course, it was the woods, and full of all sorts of terrible critters, all going about their business, and I was the intruder. Still, as I was inside the tent listening, I didn't quite feel brave enough to open up the zipper and use the flash to see what was out there. Sure enough, in the morning, there were scratches all over one of the real big trees near the tent. Deep scratches that seemed too far up to be the small forest floor type critter. The tree also stank of urine, really strong, as if every animal around had been using it as a potty. Whatever had been there, making those marks and peeing everywhere, had been marking its territory for sure. Whilst I wasn't scared, I was unnerved, mainly by the size of whatever had visited, or the strength, if it had been able to pull itself up to make the scratches at man height. I forgot about it mostly through the daytime, and it wasn't until I laid down inside the tent again for the night when I began to wonder about the creature. As if on cue, I heard the scratching, and this time what sounded like sniffling right by the opening. I had the flashlight next to me, so I shone it towards the zipper and heard what seemed to be a yelp. Whatever was out there was also casting a shadow way bigger than I would have liked to. I almost considered packing up that morning, as well as a part of me that was anxiously thinking that, hell, whatever that thing is, whatever it could be, part of me was thinking, wait, what could it be? What was that thing? I knew I had to stay one more night and try to find out. So that night, instead of fully closing the zipper and lying down, I pulled it too loosely shut so I could open it fast and sat right next to the opening, flashlight ready. As soon as I heard the creature, I would jump out with the flash and find out what it was, once and for all. Around midnight, I heard that now familiar sound of snuffling and scratching, and sure enough, it seemed to come right up close to the tent again, like the night before. This time, of course, I was ready, and I jumped out, pointing the flash down toward the ground, which was, of course, where I expected the creature to be. Well, there were feet and legs, but as I slowly moved the flashlight up, getting more and more anxious, thinking actually this was a really bad idea, I realized this was no animal. Not in the traditional way, anyway. I heard stories of Dogman. I think I'd seen a thread on Reddit once or something similar, and thought the people must either be crazy or liars. It couldn't possibly be an actual thing. Nature wouldn't allow it. And yet, as I finished moving the flashlight upwards so I could see this monstrosity in full, I knew those people had been telling the truth. It was around my height, so 6 feet-ish, and covered in really dark hair, or I guess fur, like covered completely. It stood up straight, like a person, so the legs weren't bowed like a dog, and it had long, gangly arms too. The face was just like something of a German Shepherd. I have to say, despite being absolutely terrified by the mere existence of this thing, it did not appear threatening, and it did not try to attack me. In fact, after I just stood gawking at it for a moment, it ran off. It didn't matter though. I threw myself back into the tent, zipping it up, as if somehow the fabric would protect me, and sat there all night with the flashlight on me, jumping at every cricket, chirp, until the sun came up, and I could pack up and get out of there. One of the scariest things about this whole ordeal was that if these Dogman creatures are real, when they don't even seem remotely possible, what else is out there? It makes me never want to step into the woods or go somewhere secluded again. All these horror movies where people go camping and get killed off by hillbillies, they got it wrong. It's the cryptids you have to look out for. Because if I could come across a Dogman as big as a man, that might mean that Bigfoot, the Jersey Devil, Mothman, they could all be very real. Years ago, while hunting up in the mountains, we heard this strange noise that we can't exactly identify. We're pretty experienced hunters, and the one thing you learn very early on are the various noises of animals, and any particular predators that you'd probably want to stay away from. The only thing this sound reminded me of was the next door's dog, who was a nasty son of a gun, having bitten one of the kids, and now had to be locked up at all times when the kids were not at school. This was the same kind of warning, but there was no good reason why any dog of any size would be out there, and we hadn't seen any other trucks or signs of another party. My dad and brothers didn't seem to have heard or taken much notice. They were busy. I was fully equipped with a shotgun, and I decided to head over towards the rustling to see what was out there. The first thing I noticed as I got close were the leaves and the branches around my own height seemed to be moving, so I was even more certain that this couldn't be a dog, since it must be something that could climb. It never crossed my mind for one instant that it could be a dog the size of a man, as ridiculous as that sounds. I've heard tales of them creatures, but they were more like campfire tales, like the hookman and the dude that licks your hand under the bed. They weren't real. Couldn't be. And as I edged closer to the bushes, I could make out the rough shape of what was in there, but it didn't seem to make any sense. It couldn't be something that big unless it was another person. I had the shotgun ready, my finger on the trigger, as something just didn't feel right. A hunter's instinct. Still, I stupidly felt that I wanted to deal with this alone. Maybe prove something to my dad, since it was almost always him or one of my brothers that brought home the prize. I didn't want to look like I was afraid, so I edged closer. I kept creeping forward, as to not spook it. Then, there it was, in my full sight. I think I stared at it for about a full minute before I took a shot, just in complete shock at this thing. That alerted the others, of course, and they came running over. I stood there for a moment, unable to tell them what I saw. My eldest brother headed off into the brush to see if I'd even hit it. It seems that I had not, and there was no creature not to be seen nor blood on the ground. But I don't know how I could have missed. They were all talking at once, and I was trying to tell them by yelling. It was a dog, but not a dog. Like a man, but a dog as big as a man. To this day, they still tease me about it. My brothers even joke that I saw a werewolf. But I knew what I saw. It was this strange creature, but not as giant as I would think. Like a direwolf or something. This thing was like the body of a man, but the head of a dog. At least, I like to think so. And I believe it's still out there somewhere.